They ruled nations with an iron fist. They dragged the entire world into a war that left millions dead. For years they seemed untouchable, almost immortal. But absolute power has an expiration date, and when the end approached, there were no speeches, no crowds, no glory, only loneliness, betrayal, blood, and silence. Some chose a bullet, others were swept away by vengeance. All faced their judgment, sooner or later. Today we will take you to the exact moment when the most feared dictators of the Second World War met their end. How did they really die? Who was there? What did they leave behind after their fall? This was the death of the top dictators of World War II. For years, their voices resonated above the clamor of the world. With clenched fists and fiery words, they promised eternal empires, impossible purities, definitive victories. Each one, from their podium, claimed history for themselves, as if time were their servant and fear their shield. They were faces of stone, carved by propaganda, figures that seemed invulnerable to judgment, error, and decay. But absolute power does not protect from fate, not even for them. The end came as night falls on a battlefield, slow at first, then suddenly drenched in fire and despair. There was no redemption for those who trampled entire villages. There was no escape for those who believed they were above the blood they spilled. Their fall was not heroic. It was brutal, solitary, shameful. Some chose to die before witnessing their defeat. They locked themselves within concrete and steel walls beneath cities that were crumbling, and with the ink still fresh from broken promises, they extinguished themselves by their own hand. Others were caught by the tide of hatred they themselves had unleashed. Stripped of uniforms and honors, dragged, exposed, hanged as a warning, as punishment, as a symbol of an era that refused to die in silence. There were those who, still covered in medals, fled disguised, hidden under false identities, hoping the world would forget. But the truth always emerges, sometimes with the fury of a tribunal, other times with the relentless memory of a survivor. Their deaths did not cleanse their sins, nor did they close the wounds, but they marked the end of an illusion, because although they promised order, they brought ruin. Though they spoke of homeland, they sowed ruins that still moan beneath the stones. Though they proclaimed themselves saviors, they were architects of the abyss. Those who once filled squares with fanatic crowds ended up alone, betrayed even by those who had once chanted their names. And thus the world watched as not only men fell, but myths as well. Because every empire of fear, sooner or later, finds the edge of its own collapse. History will remember them, not for their glory, but for their ruin. Not for their speeches, but for the echoes of millions who died under their shadow, not as leaders, but as a warning. And indeed, titans do not die with honor. They fall with a crash, and on the ground where their blood mixes with the mud, there germinates, slowly, painfully, the memory that prevents us from repeating them. Adolf Hitler, the death of the Führer. For years he was the face of terror, the embodiment of absolute power in Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler, the man who triggered the Second World War and orchestrated one of the most atrocious genocides in history, ended his life under circumstances as silent as they were elusive, locked in a bunker beneath the rubble of an empire that was crumbling. But before reaching that final point, we must go back in time and understand how the character was built who would eventually be confined underground, fearing until the last second for his fate. Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small town on the border between Austria and Germany. His childhood was marked by the strict discipline of his father and the adoration he felt for his mother. As a young man, he dreamed of being an artist, and his failure to enter the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna was only the first of many blows. He wandered the streets, lived in shelters, and gradually became immersed in the nationalist and anti-Semitic ideas that began to spread in early 20th century Vienna. World War I was a turning point. He enlisted as a volunteer in the Bavarian army and served as a messenger. He was wounded and decorated for bravery, but the German defeat left him devastated. Like many others, the surrender and the Treaty of Versailles seemed to him an intolerable humiliation. This resentment was the fuel that led him to politics. Throughout the 1920s, Hitler forged his path as a speaker and leader of the National Socialist Party. In 1933, he was appointed Chancellor of Germany and soon consolidated a totalitarian dictatorship. The rest is known: territorial expansion, the outbreak of the war, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Holocaust, and finally, the slow but irreversible collapse of the Third Reich. But in the last months of the war, nothing remained of the victorious Führer who had marched through Paris. The Allied offensive from the west and the unstoppable advance of the Red Army from the east left Germany surrounded, devastated, and its leader trapped in a spiral of denial and paranoia. April 30th, 1945. Berlin. It is Monday. Outside, the city is a flaming cemetery. Soviet artillery relentlessly hammers every corner of central Berlin. The concrete shakes, the facades crumble, and the sky remains covered with thick smoke that erases any hope of salvation. The streets, once a symbol of Nazi power, are covered with bodies, ashes, and ruins. The Berliners who still survive are hiding in basements and subway stations. There is no water, no electricity, and almost no food left. Berlin is an agonizing city, and at its core, about 10 meters underground, Adolf Hitler spends his last hours in the Führer bunker. The bunker, built to withstand aerial attacks, is not a place designed for life. Narrow, damp, and without proper ventilation, it has been improvised as the dictator's headquarters during the last months of the war. In this underground refuge, the Führer is surrounded only by his closest circle: secretaries, military assistants, doctors, and the few Nazi leaders who have not yet fled or taken their own lives. Hitler is no longer the man who spoke before fervent crowds. He is aged, hunched, with a pale and emaciated face. His voice is barely a whisper. He walks with difficulty and suffers from constant tremors, especially in his left hand. Some claim he suffers from Parkinson's, although there was never a formal diagnosis. Others believe he is simply destroyed, both physically and mentally. His authority, once unquestionable, has faded. Only the echo of power remains, a shadow of the absolute control he once wielded over Europe. For days, Hitler has not left his office. He reviews imaginary maps, deploys non-existent divisions, and issues orders that no one follows. He has fallen into absolute denial. He still believes Berlin can resist. He still dreams of German divisions surrounding the Soviets, but each hour brings worse news. The Red Army troops are just a few streets from the bunker. The fighting is heard on the surface. Explosions shake the concrete walls. It is the end. On April 28th, Hitler learns that Heinrich Himmler, one of his oldest allies, has tried to negotiate surrender with the Allies. It is the ultimate betrayal. Enraged, he breaks all ties with his former SS protector. There is no longer any doubt. He is completely alone. In the early hours of April 29th, surrounded by bombings and under the dim light of a desk lamp, Hitler marries Eva Braun. She has been his companion for more than a decade, though always relegated to the background. Eva has rejected any attempt to escape. She has decided to die with him. The ceremony takes place in a room of the bunker, with no celebration or external witnesses. After the act, both share a light meal. Hitler tries a small cake. Eva barely eats. Hours later, Hitler writes his political testament. He dictates it in a monotone, as if trying to justify his legacy before history. He attributes the war to the Jews, insists he will not surrender, and names his successors. Joseph Goebbels will be the new Chancellor and Admiral Karl Dönitz, President of the Reich. He also gives strict orders. His remains must be burned. He does not want to meet the same fate as Benito Mussolini, lynched and exposed in the square of Milan. April 30th, noon. Hitler meets for the last time with his closest collaborators. He thanks them for their service. There is no ceremony, no memorable words. He shakes their hands one by one. Some cry, others remain in a deathly silence. They know they are witnessing the end of an era. The atmosphere is tense, unreal. Outside, the gunshots do not cease. At 14:30, Hitler and Eva retire to their private room. They carry with them 2 cyanide capsules. Hitler also holds his Walter PPK pistol, caliber 7.65 millimeters, the same one he has kept throughout the war. In the hallway, Otto Günscher, his personal assistant, waits alongside Martin Bormann and some officers. No one says a word. The minutes pass slowly. The silence becomes unbearable. Approximately at 15:30, a shot is heard. There are no screams, no chaos. Just that single metallic sound muffled by the thick walls of the bunker. Günscher and Bormann enter the room. They find Hitler slumped on the sofa with a gunshot wound to his temple. Blood and brain matter splatter the wall and the floor. In his right hand, he still holds the pistol. Beside him, Eva Braun lies lifeless. She shows no visible wounds. Everything indicates she bit the cyanide capsule. The scene is overwhelming. Despite everything it represents, those present do not express horror. They were prepared. They proceed immediately with the instructions. They wrap the bodies in blankets, carry them down the hall to the exit of the bunker, to the Chancellor's garden, where the ruins are still burning. There, they place the bodies in an improvised grave, douse them with large amounts of gasoline, and set them on fire. The flames consume them under the crossfire of the Soviets. In the distance, explosions continue. No one interrupts the process. Several officers stand at attention in silence. The scene is brief, dry, as was the entire farewell. The man who once had the world at his feet disappears in an improvised bonfire in an anonymous corner of a ruined city. The last 48 hours of the Third Reich. After his death, chaos takes over the bunker. Some of those present try to escape. Others, like the Goebbels, resign themselves. On May 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda poison their 6 children, one by one, in one of the rooms of the bunker. Then, both commit suicide. The bodies are burned with difficulty. Gasoline is scarce. On May 2nd, Soviet troops finally capture the sector where the bunker is located. Berlin officially surrenders. World War II, at least in Europe, is ending. What remains of the bunker is recorded and sealed. Investigations begin. The Soviets claim to have found Hitler's remains, partially burned, identified by his jaw, which was compared to dental X-rays. But from there, everything becomes confusing. The Soviets hide the remains and manipulate the information. Stalin even hints that Hitler may have escaped. For years, the USSR denies having conclusive proof. The body disappears in the labyrinths of the Cold War. Did Hitler really die on that April 30th? Or was it a hoax? How reliable are the witnesses? What happened to the remains? Why were they hidden for decades? Doubts multiplied. Some claimed to have seen him in Argentina, others in Brazil, in Antarctica, or even in secret underground bases. Books, documentaries, dubious witnesses. Theories flourished where evidence was scarce. The official history states that he died like a coward, committing suicide to avoid facing the consequences. But the lack of a body, the concealment of information, and the contradictions fueled a mystery that still today has not fully dissipated. Because Hitler's end was not just the end of a dictator, it was the beginning of a dark legend, a legend that is still alive. And in the next chapter, we will follow that trail, to explore the roots, the documents, the alternative versions, to ask ourselves, what if it wasn't the end? What if, after all, history did not end in that bunker? Benito Mussolini, the fall of the Duce. Benito Mussolini was, for more than 2 decades, the face of Italian fascism. Founder of an authoritarian regime, promoter of aggressive nationalism, and a close ally of Adolf Hitler, his fall was not only the collapse of a dictator, but also a brutal, improvised, and controversial scene that continues to raise questions today. Before becoming a dictator, Mussolini was a restless young man born on July 29, 1883, in Dovia di Predapio, a small village in northern Italy. The son of a socialist blacksmith and a Catholic teacher, he showed an intense personality from a young age, with radical political inclinations. He was a teacher, journalist, socialist activist, and later, after being expelled from the Socialist Party for supporting Italian intervention in World War I, he founded the Fasci di Combattimento in 1919, the seed of fascism. His rise was rapid. In 1922, after the March on Rome, he was appointed Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Italy. From that moment, he concentrated power, dissolved parliamentary democracy, persecuted his opponents, and proclaimed himself Il Duce, the leader. Under his government, Italy aligned with Nazi Germany, participated in the invasion of Ethiopia, intervened in the Spanish Civil War, and eventually dragged Italy into the Second World War, but the military adventure was a disaster. In 1943, when the Allies began bombing Italy and advancing from the south, the regime collapsed. He was arrested, freed by the Nazis, and placed as the head of a puppet state in the north of the country, the Italian Social Republic, based in Salo. But nothing was as it had been. His power was illusory, his army almost non-existent. The country was divided, the population impoverished and exhausted. Mussolini knew that the end was near. April 27th and 28th, 1945. Lake Como. Northern Italy was in chaos. German forces were surrendering everywhere. The partisans, resistance groups made up of communists, monarchists, and anti-fascist nationalists controlled many cities. The Salo Republic was rapidly collapsing. Mussolini, cornered, decided to flee. His destination was Switzerland. He intended to cross the border and then fly to Spain or Germany. But he was no longer a head of state, not even a general. He was a fugitive. He traveled with a small German convoy, disguised with a long coat and a soldier's helmet. He had his lover, Clara Petacci, and a few loyal followers with him. They tried to blend in with the retreating troops. The convoy advanced north near Lake Como. On April 27th, near the small town of Dongo, the convoy was intercepted by partisans from the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade. They were looking for weapons and German soldiers. They did not expect to find Mussolini. But upon inspecting the vehicles, one of them believes he recognizes the dictator. He is shorter than they imagined and more aged. His eyes, once dominant, are now sunken and dull. The confirmation comes when they find his documentation. Mussolini does not resist. He says not a word. He is taken to a house in the town of Germasino. There he spends his last night with Clara Petacci. No one knows for certain what they talked about. Some witnesses claimed he cried. Others said he was resigned. The Italian fascist regime had collapsed. The war was lost. Germany was crumbling. Hitler was taking refuge in his Berlin bunker. And in Italy, the Italian Social Republic, the brief puppet state Benito Mussolini, led from Salo under Nazi protection, was little more than a fiction sustained by violence and fear. During the last weeks of April 1945, the partisans had taken control of much of northern Italy. Allied forces were advancing from the south, while German troops were retreating or surrendering completely. Mussolini's fate seemed sealed. No divisions remained to defend him, nor structures of power loyal to him. Only a small group of loyal followers and his lover Clara Petacci accompanied him in what would be his final escape. On the morning of April 27, 1945, Mussolini left Salo with the intention of reaching the Swiss border. He was disguised within a motorized column of German soldiers from the 52nd Anti-Aircraft Division of the Wehrmacht, advancing through the Lake Como area toward the border. He wore a long coat, dark glasses, and a German helmet. He had no visible insignia or personal documents. He intended to remain unnoticed. With him traveled Clara Petacci and other high-ranking fascists also trying to escape. The plan was to cross the border into Switzerland and from there seek asylum in Spain or some South American country. But the convoy was stopped near the town of Dongo on the shores of the lake by a patrol of partisans from the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade. Initially, the partisans only intended to inspect the German convoy. They were interested in capturing weaponry and preventing the escape of collaborators. One of them, Urbano Lazzaro, began to inspect the trucks. Upon checking one of the vehicles, he noticed a hunched, aged man with a shifty look. He drew his attention. He asked him to get out of the vehicle. He searched him. Soon he found documents confirming his identity. It was Benito Mussolini. The Duce did not resist. He was exhausted, physically worn out, and, according to witnesses, completely silent. He didn't attempt to speak. He did not beg. He was taken along with Clara Petacci to a rural house in Germasino, a few kilometers away. There they spent their last night, April 28th. The decision. The leadership of the National Liberation Committee, led by communist and socialist leaders, received the news of the arrest. After brief consultations, a definitive decision was made. Mussolini was to be executed without trial. The fear was clear. If he fell into the hands of the Allies, he could be used as a political pawn or even escape justice by claiming immunity or rights as a former head of state. The partisans wanted to avoid another Nuremberg. The order was transmitted quickly. Walter Audizio, a partisan from the Communist Party, was tasked with carrying it out. He went by the name Colonel Valerio during the operation. He claimed to have received direct instructions from Milan. The Duce was to die that very afternoon. In the early hours of April 28th, a small van picked up Mussolini and Clara Petacci. The weather was grey, the air humid, and the tension palpable. The road twisted through the hills of Lake Como. No one spoke. Near noon, the vehicle stopped in front of Villa Belmonte, a rural house in Giulino di Mezzegra. There, just a few meters from a stone wall, the dictator's end would be realized. Walter Audizio instructed them to get out. Mussolini walked slowly, accompanied by Clara. Some witnesses claimed that the dictator appeared calm, resigned. He did not ask questions. He stood facing the wall with his hands in his pockets. Clara, on the other hand, clung to him desperately. She begged to be allowed to die by his side. Witnesses disagree on the final moments. Some claim Mussolini muttered, "Get in line." Others say he asked, "Don't shoot me in the face." There are versions that assert he tried to speak and was interrupted, but none of these phrases can be conclusively confirmed. Audizio raised his machine gun. He shot Mussolini first. The projectile hit him in the chest. Clara screamed, threw herself over the body, and was also shot. Other partisans claim a second shot was needed to finish him off. There is no full agreement. The truth is that both bodies fell to the ground and lay by the wall among the wet earth and silence. Hours later, the bodies were placed in a truck and transported to Milan. Along with them, the bodies of other fascist leaders executed that same day in various locations were taken. It was a funeral procession without glory, escorted by armed partisans. The procession arrived in the city in the early morning of April 29th. They headed for Piazzale Loreto, a place full of symbolism. There, less than a year before, the fascists had executed 15 partisans and left their bodies exposed to the public. It was time for revenge. The bodies of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and the other executed were thrown onto the pavement in front of a gas station. At dawn, a crowd began to gather. Some recognized them immediately. Soon the corpses were kicked, insulted, spat on, and beaten. A horrific spectacle of popular vengeance ensued. Then several bodies, including Mussolini's, were hung upside down from an iron beam as if they were slaughtered cattle. The images were captured by photographers and war correspondents. They circulated worldwide. The man who once dreamed of reviving the greatness of Rome was displayed as an anonymous criminal reduced to flesh, disfigured and surrounded by a hysterical crowd. The official version is clear. Mussolini was captured by partisans, executed in Giulino di Mezzegra by order of the National Liberation Committee, and his body was displayed in Milan as a symbol of the end of fascism. Over the years, various investigations have revealed contradictions. Some documents suggest Mussolini carried suitcases with secret documents, even compromising correspondence with Allied leaders. Others claim that these documents disappeared after his death. Some witnesses said they saw British officers in the area just before the execution. It has even been speculated that he was murdered by British or American agents to silence any potential hidden agreements. There were also doubts about the number of people present at the moment of the execution. Some versions suggest that Clara Petacci was not supposed to be executed, but she refused to separate from Mussolini. Others claim that both were killed elsewhere and then transported to the villa to recreate the scene. Walter Audicio's statements also changed over the years. He contradicted himself in interviews, omitted details, and was accused by other partisans of taking ownership of the narrative, an uncomfortable corpse. After his execution and exposure, Mussolini's body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Musocco cemetery. Years later, in 1946, a group of neo-fascists stole his remains. They were recovered by the authorities, hidden for more than a decade, and finally handed over to his family in 1957. Today, Benito Mussolini is buried in the San Cassiano cemetery in Predappio, his hometown, where supporters still visit every year. But the debate has not ceased. Was it justice or revenge? Who really gave the order? What secrets did Mussolini carry with him in that final escape? Why did the Italian state allow his corpse to be the object of cult for so long? What part of this story still remains locked away? Perhaps we will never have all the answers. Mussolini's end not only marked the fall of a regime, but also opened a chapter full of dark areas, lost documents, contradictory testimonies, uncomfortable silences. Because fascism did not end with a shot at Villa Belmonte, and its history, far from disappearing, remains alive in the shadows of collective memory. And it is there, in those shadows, where we must keep searching. Iosif Stalin, the end of the Soviet dictator. For 3 decades, Iosif Stalin was the unquestionable leader of the Soviet Union. He ruled with an iron fist, shaping an empire through fear, repression, and an omnipresent political control network. Under his rule, the USSR transformed from a poor rural country into an industrial and military superpower, though at the cost of millions of lives. However, no matter how absolute power may seem, even the most feared of dictators cannot resist the weight of death. Before becoming the colossal figure of the Soviet era, Stalin was simply Iosif Vissarionis Djugashvili, born on December 18, 1958 in Gori, a small town in Georgia. The son of an alcoholic shoemaker and a deeply religious mother, he grew up in poverty. He studied at an Orthodox seminary but abandoned the faith and turned to Marxism. He soon joined revolutionary circles and adopted the pseudonym that would make him famous, Stalin, the Man of Steel. He participated in robberies, worker uprisings, and clandestine conspiracies. He was arrested multiple times and sent into exile in Siberia. After the October Revolution, he joined the Bolshevik leadership under Lenin. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin maneuvered skillfully to become the supreme leader of the Communist Party. He eliminated rivals, purged his enemies, and reorganized the state in his image. At his peak, his word was law. World War II solidified his power. The victory over Nazi Germany earned him a place among the victors, alongside Roosevelt and Churchill. But as Europe rebuilt, Stalin continued to rule with distrust, expanding his influence over Eastern Europe, watching his own men and eliminating possible traitors before they even thought of betraying him. And so, between the cult of personality and fear of conspiracy, the end of his life arrived. Stalin's dacha was not a luxurious palace, but it was a fortified refuge. Isolated with thick walls and surrounded by forests, it was where the leader spent his last years, increasingly removed from public life and surrounded only by those he considered absolutely trustworthy. Although in reality, he trusted no one. On February 28, 1953, Stalin met with several of his closest men, Lavrenti Beria, head of the secret police, Georgy Malenkov, Nikita Khrushchev, and Nikolai Bulganin. They spent the night drinking, eating, and watching movies. It was a routine that often repeated itself. The leader, already 74 years old, appeared tired but still dominated the conversation. No one spoke first. No one got up without his signal. His presence still commanded absolute respect. Around 4 in the morning on March 1st, Stalin retired to his room. He ordered not to be disturbed. The guards and assistants obeyed. Hours later, an unusual silence fell over the dacha. The day passed without any sign of the dictator. No one dared enter his room. By 10 in the morning, he had not come out. By noon, still nothing. By 6 in the evening, fear began to settle among his staff, but still the order to not disturb Comrade Stalin weighed more than any suspicion. Finally, after 10 at night, one of the guards, with extreme caution, dared to open the door. Stalin lay on the floor, between the bed and a small table, dressed in his pajamas, unconscious, with his face turned downward. He had urinated on himself. He did not respond to any stimuli. His breathing was shallow and irregular. At that moment, terror gripped everyone. Instead of immediately calling the doctors, the staff decided to notify the members of the Politburo. Lavrenti Beria arrived first. He approached the lifeless body, and according to witnesses, he seemed relieved to see Stalin in that state. He observed him for a few minutes, smiled slightly, and said that the comrade was simply asleep. No urgent measures were taken. No ambulance was called. No specialized help was sought. Only on the morning of March 2nd, more than 12 hours after being found, did the doctors gain access. Stalin had suffered a massive stroke, with paralysis on his right side, respiratory difficulties, and loss of consciousness. It was evident that his condition was critical. Still, the treatment was limited, delayed, and for many deliberately ineffective. In the following days, Stalin remained unconscious. The leader of the Soviet Union, the most feared man in the country, lay in a bed unable to speak or move while his possible successors began to maneuver in the shadows. The political atmosphere was tense, heavy. No one knew if he was about to die, or if, at any moment, he could awaken and exact revenge on everyone. Beria, in particular, seemed to move with a mixture of euphoria and nervousness. According to various testimonies, he repeatedly said triumphantly, "There's no Stalin anymore. There are no more problems." It was clear that some had not expected his recovery. Some even feared it more than his death. On the night of March 5th, at 21:50, after several days of agony, Iosif Stalin died. The medical report stated a cardiopulmonary collapse, a direct consequence of a stroke. He was 74 years old. The news was communicated to the Soviet people the next day with solemnity and reverence. Several days of national mourning were declared. His body was displayed at the House of Columns in Moscow, where hundreds of thousands of people stood in endless lines to bid farewell to the father of the peoples. Stampedes were recorded. Several citizens were crushed in the crowd. On March 9th, Stalin was buried alongside Lenin in the Red Square mausoleum. His face, serene and made up, showed no sign of the final hours of a man who had built an empire of surveillance, and who in the end died alone, surrounded by silence and fear. Stalin's death, officially attributed to natural causes, has been the subject of controversy for decades. Why was it so delayed to provide him with medical attention? Why was Beria the first to arrive, and the last to want to act? Was it a natural death or a silent form of murder? Could he have been poisoned? Was he left to die deliberately? Some investigators have suggested that the medications administered were inadequate or that certain treatments were intentionally omitted. Others argue that Stalin was about to launch a new purge, this time even targeting members of the Politburo. In fact, just days before his stroke, he had approved a new cycle of mass arrests under the so-called Doctors' Plot. Many feared that his next victim would be Beria, or even Khrushchev. Did they conspire to let him die? There was never an official investigation. The regime simply moved forward. Within weeks, Beria was arrested and executed by his former colleagues. The balance of power was reconfigured. The cult of Stalin began to weaken, and his figure, though feared, was slowly displaced from the Soviet political center. Power and silence. Stalin died without witnesses. He died without resistance, perhaps betrayed by his own system. He died as he lived, surrounded by fear, secrecy, and subordinates who did not dare to act without permission. And yet his legacy survived his body. The Gulag did not disappear immediately. Surveillance persisted. The USSR remained a feared power, but something broke. The myth of the infallible, eternal, omnipresent leader collapsed that March night. Did he really die of natural causes? Or was it the final act of a power machinery that no longer needed him? And what secrets did he take with him? In the next episode, we will investigate what happened afterward. The internal struggles, the fall of Beria, the lost documents, and the mysterious conspiracy that may have precipitated the end of the most feared man of the 20th century. Because in Stalin's death, as in his life, the questions outnumber the answers, and the silence that surrounds him is perhaps the greatest testimony to his power. Hirohito, the dusk of the emperor. For more than 6 decades, Japan had an unchanging face, that of Emperor Hirohito. For some, he was a divine figure, a symbol of national unity and stability. For others, a silent witness, or even accomplice, to the militarism that led Asia to the abyss during the Second World War. Born on April 29, 1901 in Tokyo, Hirohito was the first son of Emperor Taisho and Empress Taimei. From a young age, he was educated rigorously under the traditional precepts of Imperial Japan. In 1921, while still the heir to the throne, he embarked on a journey through Europe, becoming the first member of the imperial family to visit the West. The experience left a lasting impression, although his country would soon take a very different path. Hirohito became emperor in 1926. His era, named Showa, Enlightened Peace, would not be free from contradictions. Under his reign, Japan transformed into an industrial and military power, but also unleashed brutal wars in China, Korea, and the Pacific. In his name, battles were fought in Nanking, Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The surrender on August 15, 1945, changed his figure forever. In a historic radio broadcast, Hirohito announced Japan's capitulation, asking the people to endure the unbearable. For the first time, his voice was heard by the nation. He was no longer an untouchable god, but a man faced with defeat. After the war, and by decision of General MacArthur and the occupying authorities, Hirohito retained his throne, though stripped of his divine status. His role became ceremonial, but he survived. He reigned during the Reconstruction, the economic transformation, and the modernization. He saw his country rise from the ruins and become one of the world's greatest technological powers. However, Hirohito's figure remained ambiguous. He was never judged for war crimes. His responsibility in the military decisions of the empire remained unclear, hidden among classified documents and political will. Even so, until the end, he was a symbol of 20th century Japan, and his death would mark the definitive closure of that era. January 6, 1989, Imperial Hospital, Tokyo. Winter had arrived in the Japanese capital with its usual solemnity. The streets, despite the cold, remained orderly, serene, contained. In the Imperial Hospital in Tokyo, however, the atmosphere was different. There, surrounded by doctors, royal family members, and palace staff, Emperor Hirohito was dying. He had been admitted several months earlier, in September of 1988, after suffering a severe intestinal hemorrhage. He underwent surgery. The official reports were brief, vague. They mentioned a pancreatic illness. In reality, he had advanced cancer. For weeks, both national and international press monitored every official announcement. In the streets, some citizens awaited news anxiously, others with indifference. In homes, the years of war, the economic rebirth, and the image of the soft-spoken emperor with a distant gaze who had witnessed everything from the atomic bombings to the Tokyo Olympics were remembered. The night before January 5th, his condition became critical. His blood pressure dropped, and his heart rate became irregular. The doctors spoke of multiple organ failure. He had lost consciousness. The family was called. At 6:33 in the morning on January 6, 1989, Emperor Hirohito died. He was 87 years old. By his side, in silence, were his son Akihito and other members of the royal family. The news was conveyed to Prime Minister Noboru Takeshita and then broadcast nationwide to the entire country. The Showa era, which had begun in 1926, officially ended. 62 years of history came to a close. Contemporary Japan, modern, technological, now had to face the mourning of a figure who, though distant, had been constant. Unlike the outbursts of joy or shock that followed the deaths of other 20th century leaders, Hirohito's passing was met with a unique mix of contained respect, tradition, and national reflection. There were no public displays of crying. The streets were not filled with desperate crowds. Japan, faithful to its culture of control and reserve, mourned in silence. The government ordered that flags fly at half-mast. Festive events were suspended. Television channels changed their programming. Across the country, businesses, schools, and offices held moments of reflection. But it was not an emotional explosion. It was rather a national ritual of pause. Hirohito was succeeded by his son, who ascended the throne as Emperor Akihito. Thus began the Heisei era, achievement of peace, while the country prepared an unprecedented state funeral. On February 24th, 1.5 months after his death, the state funeral of Emperor Hirohito was held. It was a carefully planned event that combined ancient Shinto rituals with modern international diplomacy protocols. Delegations from more than 160 countries attended. Among the attendees were President George H.W. Bush, President François Mitterrand, Prince Charles of the United Kingdom, and leaders from around the world. Even some countries that had fought against Japan in the war, such as China and the United States, sent high-level representatives. The funeral procession was solemn. The coffin, made of cypress wood, was transported in a traditional funeral carriage. The procession, silent, crossed the heart of Tokyo, passing through silent crowds until it reached the imperial mausoleum in Hachioji, west of the capital. There, in a private ceremony, he was buried alongside his ancestors. There were no political speeches, only prayers, incense, and the sound of footsteps. In Japan, death is not a spectacle, but a transition. The emperor had passed from this world to the realm of the kami, the spirits. After his death, questions about Hirohito's role during the war resurfaced with more intensity. Why was he not judged? To what extent did he know or approve the actions of the imperial army? Did he have a real voice in strategic decisions, or was he simply a symbolic figure manipulated by the military? During his life, Hirohito never offered a clear apology for the war. He also never assumed direct responsibility. After his death, some historians began to more openly study the diaries of his collaborators, internal palace documents, and US diplomatic cables. The portrait that emerged was more complex than the one he had projected in life. He was not a dictator, but neither was he entirely detached. He had power and he used it cautiously, sometimes with calculation, sometimes with resignation. He was in part a hostage of his time, and also an architect of it. Emperor Hirohito died as he lived, in silence. He never wrote memoirs, he never answered public questions, he never gave interviews. His image was carefully preserved by imperial protocol and the machinery of the Japanese state. His voice, recorded for the first time at the end of the war, was only heard sporadically afterward. He never again spoke to the country spontaneously. He was a symbol, a porcelain figure on an ancestral throne whose value lay in his permanence, not in his presence. And yet, after his death, Japan changed. Younger generations began to question the official history. Unauthorized biographies were published. Documentaries and novels addressed what had never been said. In museums, schools, and newspapers, the imperial past began to be viewed through different lenses. But even today, there are unanswered questions. To what extent did Hirohito influence the military course of the empire? What did he know, and when did he know it? Was he an emperor who tried to prevent the war, or one who accepted its price? Was he saved by the Allies to preserve the stability of Japan, or to avoid opening a political Pandora's box? On January 6, 1989, the last emperor of Imperial Japan who experienced total war passed away. With him, a chapter that spanned Hiroshima, Pearl Harbor, the economic miracle, American occupation, and the silence of millions was closed, and as happens with figures who marked eras, their true story did not end with their death, because history is not dictated by power but by time, and the judgment still being written about Hirohito is not dictated by the emperor. It is dictated by memory. Francisco Franco, the last knight of the regime, born in El Ferrol, Galicia on December 4, 1892, Francisco Franco Bahamonde came into the world in a family tied for generations to the sea and the navy. However, from a young age, he chose the army. He entered the military academy of Toledo and soon stood out for his discipline, reserved character, and strict sense of hierarchy. It was in Morocco, during the colonial campaigns, where he forged his reputation. At the age of 33, he was already the youngest general in Europe. His role during the repression of uprisings in the Rif and his participation in the landing at Al-Hutsimas cemented his image as an effective and obedient military leader. In 1936, following the political and social polarization that tore apart the Second Republic, Franco joined the military conspiracy that led to the Spanish Civil War. The conflict, which lasted 3 years, cost hundreds of thousands of lives. With the victory of the rebel side, Franco proclaimed himself head of state and generalissimo. Thus began a personalist dictatorship that would last for nearly 40 years. During his regime, Spain witnessed the systematic repression of opponents, the absolute control of the media, the suppression of political freedoms, and a strong alliance between military power, the church, and the economic elites. Autarky, international isolation, and later a progressive economic opening during the 60s marked the different stages of François. And although he aged in power, Francisco Franco never designated an immediate successor with full powers. He preferred to maintain control until the end, and that end would come, slow, prolonged, almost agonizing. The early morning slowly advanced over Madrid, wrapped in a damp cold, as if time itself refused to move. On the streets, the silence was almost total. Some cleaning trucks passed mechanically, and the few passers-by left didn't know that, in one of the most closely guarded hospitals in the country, history was about to change forever. At the Hospital La Paz, amidst respirators, cardiac monitors, and the constant echo of discreet footsteps, Francisco Franco was approaching his last breath. In that room, isolated from the rest of the world, the dictator had been agonizing for days. He had spent weeks battling a chain of medical complications one after another. First a digestive hemorrhage, then infectious peritonitis, renal failure, and finally multi-organ collapse. He was operated on multiple times. Part of his intestine was removed. He was connected to respirators, fed through tubes, and underwent dialysis. Even experimental techniques were used to prolong his life for a few more hours. But the body of that man, who once presented himself as invincible, no longer responded. Since October 30th, Franco had no longer been in practice ruling. He was barely conscious. He had lost the ability to speak clearly, and his moments of lucidity were scarce. His close circle, doctors, ministers, military leaders, and his wife Carmen Polo, knew the outcome was only a matter of time. Outside in the media, the medical reports were read solemnly every day, trying to convey calm, even though everyone understood the true meaning of the words stationary state, favorable evolution within gravity, maintenance of vital constants. They were euphemisms for not saying the obvious. Franco was dying. Meanwhile, Prince Juan Carlos of Bourbon temporarily assumed the head of state. He had been designated by Franco himself as his successor years before, but his true loyalty was still an enigma to many within the regime. Some saw him as the continuity, others as a potential crack where changes that Spain had postponed for decades might slip through. In the higher echelons of Francois' power, the atmosphere was one of contained tension. Discreet meetings were held, speeches were drafted, and alternative scenarios were prepared. No one wanted to rush, but everyone knew the time of the caudillo was ending. Finally, at 4:20 in the early morning of November 20th, 1975, Francisco Franco Bahamonde passed away. In that moment, the life of the man who had concentrated all the levers of the Spanish state for almost 4 decades came to an end. Head of government, head of state, generalissimo of the armies, supreme leader of the national movement. A man who had survived wars, attacks, conspiracies, and who was now defeated beyond remedy by his own body. He was 82 years old. The news was kept silent for more than an hour. During this time, all protocols were confirmed, communicated to the high authorities, and the official message was organized. At 6 in the morning, radio and television interrupted their programming. A broadcaster appeared with a serious expression, dressed in black and read in a grave voice, "Spaniards, Franco has died." 3 words, nothing more. 3 words that immediately turned on televisions in thousands of homes, woke up ministers, diplomats, military personnel, journalists, and marked a before and after in the recent history of Spain. Within minutes, official tributes began, flags at half-mast, requiem masses, statements from foreign governments, and above all, a mix of feelings that was hard to describe. Relief for some, fear for others, sincere sadness in certain sectors, and restrained euphoria among those who had suffered in silence. Franco's death closed an era, but it did not resolve its consequences. His regime had not disappeared with him. The laws were still in effect. The power structures remained intact, and no one knew for certain what direction Spain would take. Franco's body was prepared in the hospital, wrapped in a white shroud, and soon after transported to the royal palace, where it would lie in state with all the honors of the state. But in that early morning, in that hospital room where everything had ended, Spain began to wake up from a long dream imposed by decree. After his death, Franco's body was transferred to the royal palace, where it was displayed with honors as a head of state. Thousands of people came to pay their respects. Some cried, others came out of obligation, others simply to closely witness the end of an era that had seemed eternal. On November 23rd, his body was transferred to the Valley of the Fallen, a massive mausoleum built during his regime, in part by political prisoners, and intended as a symbol of national reconciliation, though for many it represented the opposite, the monumentalization of Francois' victory. There he was buried alongside José Antonio Primo de Rivera, founder of the Spanish Falange. The ceremony was solemn, military, filled with religious and patriotic symbols. Official Spain bid farewell to the caudillo with rigidity and discipline. But on the margins, in homes, in whispered conversations, another narrative was already beginning. That of a country that had to choose between continuity and change. For the high command of the regime, the immediate goal was to guarantee stability. They feared a rupture, an uprising, a regression. The figure of King Juan Carlos I emerged as an unknown. He had been educated under Franco's tutelage, but his first steps pointed in a different direction. The Spanish transition, not yet formally initiated, began at that very moment in the power vacuum left by Franco. A transition that, despite pacts and silences, would require time, effort, and memory. Francisco Franco died in a hospital bed surrounded by doctors, far from the battlefield, from the office in El Pardo, from the war fronts that had marked his rise. He died clinging to power, never having resigned, never having apologized, never having explained his version of history. He did not write memoirs. There was no explicit political will. He left no final words recorded. His legacy was left at the mercy of those who would come after him, apologists, critics, historians, family members, victims, and although the dictatorship ended, his figure continued to divide Spain for decades. His name became taboo in many classrooms. His laws survived him for a time. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage and also of dispute, and his face, hardened by age and official portraits, continued to stare at us from books, old coins, archives, and silences. Who was Francisco Franco really? A savior of the Republican chaos or a cruel dictator? A pragmatic man or a staunch ideologue? A military man without political ambitions or an autocrat who believed himself indispensable? Did he stay in power out of conviction or out of fear of what would come afterward? History, as always, does not answer clearly. What is clear, however, is that on November 20th, 1975, not only did a man die, a time died. But not all of his traces disappeared with him. Miklos Horthy, the end of the regent of Hungary. Before the 20th century fell into its final turns of iron and blood, before total wars, before broken treaties, there was a man who saw an empire crumble and tried to keep a fragment of its former glory alive. His name was Miklos Horthy, and for more than 2 decades he was the regent of the Kingdom of Hungary, a nation that, without a king, needed a figure of command. Born in 1868, in the heart of a noble family in Lower Hungary, Horthy was educated as a naval officer in the Austro-Hungarian Navy. His career took him to various corners of the world, and his loyalty to Emperor Franz Joseph positioned him as one of the most trusted officers. He served as an aide-de-camp to the emperor himself, and during the First World War, he commanded the Austro-Hungarian fleet in the Adriatic. But the end of the war brought the collapse of the empire. Austria-Hungary ceased to exist, and Hungary fell into a series of political crises, foreign occupations, and a brief Soviet republic. In 1920, amid chaos and fear, Horthy was chosen as regent of Hungary, assuming a role that, in theory, was temporary. But he held it for 24 years. He governed as a nationalist conservative with authoritarian leanings. His regime repressed communist movements, limited civil rights, and maintained a firm alliance with the country's more traditional sectors. Over time, he grew closer to Nazi Germany, although always with a degree of ambiguity. In 1944, when he attempted to negotiate with the Allies to pull Hungary out of the war, he was deposed by the Nazis and interned in Germany. When the conflict ended, he was not tried at Nuremberg. He was released and exiled to Portugal. He spent the rest of his days in the coastal town of Estoril, far from the Danube, far from Budapest, and far from the throne he once ruled without a crown. February 9th, 1957, Estoril, Portugal. It was Saturday, a quiet day in the peaceful Portuguese town where many European exiles had found refuge after the Second World War. The Atlantic waves gently struck the coast and the sky was overcast, though without the threat of rain. In a discreet but elegant house, Miklos Horthy woke up for the last time. He was 88 years old. His body, marked by age, moved slowly. Most of his time was spent in bed or in a chair next to the window from where he gazed at the garden. He lived with part of his family and had regular medical assistance. His days were quiet, almost monotonous. He received few visits. His memoirs had already been published in English, and Hungary, under the communist regime, had almost completely erased him from official memory. On the morning of February 9th, Horthy did not feel well. His breathing was weaker than usual. The doctor who assisted him was called immediately, but could do little more than confirm that the end was imminent. There was no obvious suffering, no agonizing crisis. His body simply began to fade little by little. The heart, exhausted, stopped beating naturally. He died in his bed without ceremony and without notable witnesses. His death was discreetly communicated. The news did not make international headlines. In Hungary, where the communist regime ruled with an iron fist, his death was barely mentioned. For the Budapest government, Horthy was a symbol of the feudal, conservative, and reactionary past that should be forgotten. In exile, however, his figure still commanded respect among certain monarchist and nationalist circles. Some exiles came to say their farewells. A funeral was organized in Estoril without excess. He was buried in the local cemetery, far from the land he had once ruled. For decades, his remains rested there in silence while Hungary went through socialism, the repression of 1956, the reform of 1989, and its opening to the West. In 1993, with the collapse of communism, his remains were finally transferred to Hungary and buried in the family cemetery in Kenderes, his hometown. That act reopened old wounds. Some considered him a patriot who defended Hungarian sovereignty in difficult times. Others, a collaborating dictator who handed his country over to fascism. To this day, his figure still generates debates in Hungary. His life and death reflect the deep tensions of a country caught between imperial past, war, Nazi occupation, communism, and democracy. But the truth is he died far away, forgotten by many and surrounded by the soft fog of exile. Did he think of his country in his final moments? Did he feel guilt, nostalgia, pride? Did his mind return to the Danube, to the parades, to the palaces of the old empire? Or did he simply accept, as the sailor he was, that he had reached the last port? Those questions, like so many others from his time, were lost with him. And yet the story of Miklos Horthy does not end with his death. Because in the folds of his legacy, in the documents, in the testimonies, in the decisions he made and those he did not make, there still lie keys to understanding not only an era, but the dilemmas that Europe still drags. Because the end of Horthy was not just the end of a man. It was the quiet closure of one of the last windows that faced the old world. And perhaps in that silence there is still something to be heard. Ion Antonescu, the end of the Romanian Marshal. Ion Antonescu was born on June 15, 1882 in Pitești, a city in the region of Wallachia in what was then the Kingdom of Romania. The son of an army officer, from a young age he was surrounded by the rigor of military discipline. He was trained at the officers' school and later at the higher war school, rising quickly due to his tactical intelligence, strong character, and firm dedication. During World War I, he served as a staff officer and in the following decades held various diplomatic and military positions. He was a military attaché in Paris and London and later became the Minister of Defense. His reputation was that of an austere, uncompromising, and deeply nationalist military man. In September of 1940, amid a national crisis caused by the loss of territories and pressure from extremist movements, King Carol II appointed him Prime Minister with extraordinary powers. Within days, Antonescu forced the abdication of the king and assumed absolute power as Conducator of Romania. He allied with Nazi Germany, joined the Axis, and led a military dictatorship that actively participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. During his rule, tens of thousands of Jews, Romani people, and political opponents were deported, murdered, or forced into slave labor, particularly in Transnistria. His regime was brutal and profoundly anti-Semitic, though he kept his distance from the fascist fanaticism of the Iron Guard, which he eventually suppressed. In August of 1944, when the Soviet advance already threatened Romanian territory, King Michael I organized a palace coup. Antonescu was arrested, his regime collapsed, and Romania switched sides, allying with the Allies. What followed was a long process of political and symbolic retribution. A few kilometers from Bucharest, under a clear and silent morning, the final acts of a process that, beyond the judicial, had a marked political character were being prepared. The trial of Marshal Ion Antonescu had ended weeks earlier. Tried for war crimes, collaboration with Nazism, and internal repression, he had been sentenced to death along with several of his closest collaborators. The Marshal, who had governed the country with absolute power for years, spent his last days in an austere cell without privileges, guarded day and night. He had appealed to history, to his duty as a patriot and military man, but the verdict did not change. Neither pleas for clemency nor calls for national honor altered the fate already set. The morning of June 1st began without incident. The prison had been on alert since the previous day. The condemned were officially informed that their execution would take place that day at 5 in the afternoon. The procedure would be brief, but with all the formalities the new regime considered necessary. Ion Antonescu received the news with the serenity of a soldier. He refused to show weakness. He accepted to commune with an Orthodox priest. He dressed soberly. He wrote a few words, possibly directed to his family or perhaps to posterity. Until the last moment, he maintained an attitude of rigid dignity, almost inflexible. Shortly before the appointed hour, he was escorted to the prison yard along with Mihai Antonescu, his foreign minister with no direct family relation, General Constantin Vasiliu, and Gheorghe Alexianu, governor of Transnistria. They were lined up side by side in front of a wall. The execution squad was composed of soldiers designated for the act. The moment was not broadcast or documented with visual accuracy. There were no journalists, only a small group of officials, military personnel, and representatives of the new communist power. Ion Antonescu, firm and without blindfolds, addressed the soldiers before the shot. His exact words have been subject to contradictory versions, but all agree that he demanded they shoot him in the heart, as befitting a soldier. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the shots echoed in the Hilava yard. The bodies of the 4 men fell instantly. There was no ceremony. They were secretly buried in a mass grave without crosses or plaques, somewhere on the outskirts of Bucharest. Their remains were never officially identified, although decades later some researchers and family members tried to locate the exact place of the execution. With Antonescu's death, a dark and controversial chapter in Romanian history was closed, but as often happens in Central Europe, not everyone agreed on what his figure represented. During the communist regime that consolidated in the following years, his memory was erased from the official narrative or shown only as a symbol of fascism. However, after the fall of communism in 1989, his figure resurged in some sectors of society. He was reclaimed by nationalist movements, who presented him as a patriot who tried to save the country in difficult times. Commemorative plaques, busts, and public debates revived a figure who had been executed as a war criminal. And so, Ion Antonescu remains a deeply divisive character. Was he a brutal dictator who collaborated with one of the bloodiest regimes in history, or a patriotic military man who made mistakes amid the chaos of war? His death, quick and without external witnesses, left many questions unanswered. What did he think in his final moments? Did he still justify his actions? Did he believe he had been betrayed by his king, by his country? Did he see himself as a martyr, or simply as a man defeated by the irreversible course of history? The archives from the time are incomplete. Many statements were edited, other documents were lost or remain classified. And in that historical darkness, as with so many deaths of fallen leaders, the image of Antonescu blurs between facts and interpretations. The truth is, the Marshal died in front of a wall in the same country he had ruled with an iron fist, without an official farewell, without military glory. And yet his shadow continues to cast itself on Romania's contemporary history. Because sometimes the echoes of certain shots do not fade with time. They still resonate, and with them the questions that history has yet to answer. Vidkun Quisling, the last day of the Norwegian traitor. Vidkun Quisling was born on July 18, 1887 in Fyresdal, a small village in the south of Norway. He was the son of a Lutheran pastor, which marked his childhood with a strict moral education. A brilliant and disciplined student, he entered the Norwegian Military Academy, graduating with honors. During the early years of the 20th century, he built a reputation as a competent and reserved officer, deeply nationalist and with strong anti-communist convictions. He was sent as a military attaché to Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, an experience that would shape his political thought. Later, he worked with the League of Nations on humanitarian efforts. Upon his return to Norway, he ventured into politics with increasingly authoritarian ideas. In 1933, he founded the National Samling Party, a nationalist and fascist organization inspired by Germany, although he never managed to gain significant support. But everything changed on April 9, 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded Norway. On that same day, without prior warning and without official authority, Quisling proclaimed himself Prime Minister in a radio broadcast. The Nazi occupation regime soon used him as a symbolic figure, a compliant collaborator willing to govern Norway under the designs of the Third Reich. Over the next 5 years, Quisling became the visible face of collaboration, while the country suffered repression, deportations, and hunger under the German boot. With the German capitulation in May of 1945, Vidkun Quisling's fate was sealed. He was arrested by the Norwegian Provisional Government and tried for high treason. The verdict was clear: guilty. The sentence: death by firing squad. October 24, 1945. The night in Oslo was cold, with a sky covered by dense clouds that concealed the moon. Inside the former Akershus fortress, a medieval complex transformed into a prison, the guards maintained strict vigilance. The most secure cell housed the man who had come to embody national betrayal, Vidkun Quisling. He had spent the last months between interrogations, trials, and isolation. He had written letters, made pleas, and attempted to justify his actions under the logic of the lesser evil. He claimed that his collaboration with Germany had prevented greater suffering for Norway, and that he had tried to protect the country from within the occupation system. His arguments did not convince the court or the people. The sentence had been signed days earlier. He would be executed in the early hours of October 24th. The authorities decided that everything should be carried out with sobriety, without spectacle or unnecessary witnesses. The news would not be made public until after the act. Close to midnight, he was officially informed. Quisling, now 58 years old, reacted with a mix of resignation and defiance. He requested to speak with a Lutheran priest, who accompanied him in his final moments. According to the priest's testimony, Quisling remained serene, convinced that history would absolve him. At 2:40 in the early morning, he was escorted to the inner courtyard of the fortress. He walked slowly with firm steps. He wore a dark coat. He didn't ask to be blindfolded. He refused a final meal. There were no grandiloquent words, just a slight nod to the commanding officer. In front of the firing squad, he took his position. The officer gave the order. The shots rang out. Vidkun Quisling fell to the stone ground without any flailing. A doctor immediately approached. He confirmed the death. It was 2:45 in the morning. The body was removed without ceremony. It was buried in an unmarked grave in a location not revealed to the public. The authorities wanted to avoid the place becoming a site of pilgrimage or protest. No tributes or commemorations were allowed. Quisling's death was meant to mark the definitive closure of one of the darkest chapters in Norwegian history. A few hours later, the news was officially communicated. The reaction in the country was one of silent relief. There were no celebrations, but also no laments. In the streets of Oslo, people looked at each other, said little. The name Quisling was already synonymous with traitor, literally. In several languages, Quisling became a word to describe the collaborator, the one who delivers their country to the invader. With his death, Norway closed a cycle of humiliation and violence, but Quisling's figure did not disappear completely. Decades later, historians, psychologists, and political analysts have tried to understand the figure. Was he an opportunist, a convinced fanatic, a man trapped in his own ambition? Some reports reveal that during his trial, Quisling displayed symptoms of paranoia, messianic delusions, even a firm belief in being misunderstood. He considered himself a patriot, a reformer, someone called to lead Norway into a new era. Others simply see him as a man who wanted power and obtained it at the highest possible price. In his last letters, he spoke of injustice, of distorted history, but he never expressed remorse. The early morning of October 24th, 1945 was silent. There were no external witnesses, no recordings, only official records, brief testimonies, sparse documents, and a name that still divides opinions today. Vidkun Quisling died without applause, without funerals, without a visible grave. But his legacy of betrayal, ambition, and national tragedy remains present in the collective memory of Norway and the world. And despite his physical disappearance, his figure raises an uncomfortable question that history has yet to fully resolve. Where does betrayal begin, and where does obedience end? A question that even today continues to resonate in every era of crisis. World War II did not just leave cities in ruins, millions of deaths, and a new global order. It also marked the end of a generation of leaders who, for years, shaped the world through ideology, repression, and war. But even the most feared men found their limit. One by one, the dictators who played central roles in the most devastating conflict in history began to fall. Adolf Hitler, trapped in his bunker under the rubble of Berlin, chose suicide before seeing the world he helped destroy. Benito Mussolini, fleeing disguised across the Italian border, was executed without trial and hung before an enraged crowd. Joseph Stalin, the absolute victor of the East, died in his bed but surrounded by distrust, isolated, and with the terror he had sown. Hirohito, the deified emperor, died in peace decades after the war, but his figure remains shrouded in silence and the ambiguity of imperial responsibility. Francisco Franco survived the conflict, but his death in 1975 marked the exhaustion of a dictatorship rooted in fear and control. Miklos Horthy, removed from power by the Nazis he once tolerated, died in exile, forgotten by a Hungary that no longer recognized him as a leader. Ion Antonescu was shot by his own countrymen while claiming to have served his homeland. Vidkun Quisling, the Norwegian collaborator whose name became synonymous with betrayal, died in the early morning in front of a firing squad. They died in different ways: suicides, shootings, diseases, silent exiles. But all shared the same end: isolation. Despite having ruled with absolute power, they all faced their final hour with a loneliness that contrasted with the omnipotence they once exercised. And yet, their ideas, their traces, their crimes did not die with them. The scars they left on their nations, the social divisions, the suffering of millions continue as an uncomfortable reminder, because regimes die, but the questions remain. How did they come to power? Why were they followed by so many? Could it happen again? Sometimes history does not close with a bullet nor with a sealed coffin. Sometimes it begins anew on the margins, in the speeches that repeat, in the symbols that return disguised as modernity. The death of these men marked the end of an era, but vigilance, analysis, and memory remain living tasks, because the 20th century did not only leave us ruins, it also left us warnings. And perhaps the most unsettling thing is that some of them have still not been fully heard.